Hey everyone, just wanted to give you a quick heads up. The second Global Product Owner Summit is coming soon. You can get all the details at bit.ly/Product Owner 2024. That's bit.ly/Product Owner 2024. And it's all lowercase, all one word. Oh, and stick with us until the end of the episode to know the dates and the tracks that we have for you in this year's summit. But for now, let's dive into today's episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special bonus episode. It's so special, you can't even imagine how special it is, but we'll get to that in a second. Our guest for today is Michelle Pauk. Hey, Michelle. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Vasco. How are you?
So Michelle is the founder of Streamside Coaching, where she helps leaders and organizations thrive with change. She has over 15 years of experience working in diverse Agile environments as a product owner, Scrum Master, project manager, and Agile Coach. That's a diverse set of roles right there. And she's a professional certified coach with the ICF, the International Coaching Federation, and has a master's degree in leadership and organizational development. It's a pleasure to have you here on the show, Michelle. And before I ask you a first question, I do need to be upfront with our listeners and say that this is going to be a little bit of a let's just have fun with a system of concepts type of episode. We'll see where this goes, but we're going to talk about complexity and systems of control, a bit more on that later. So don't go away yet. We'll explain that in a second. Michelle has been a guest at the Agile Online Summit 2023, where she keynoted about happiness for Agile coaches, which was a very important and also very entertaining conversation with the hosts. So I invite you to check that out if you haven't yet. And we ended up talking about different topics, connecting later, and we discovered that we both appreciate the work that Michel Foucault did. Michel is, or Foucault, I should say, is a philosopher, and he has these theories on power, culture, and discourse that we will explore today and how that affects our work as Agile coaches. But first, let's get to know Michelle a little bit more. So, Michelle, can you share with us your journey into becoming an Agile coach? What inspired you to get into this role?
Yeah. So I had a bit of a roundabout way of coming to this work, and it's actually interesting that we're talking about Michel Foucault because I first got exposed to his thinking when I was in my undergraduate, which was in English literature and also Italian literature. And so I had fully intended to, live the life of a poet or a professor or something. And that didn't work out. I ended up finding a job at a software company that did language learning software, and it was an agile shop. This is close to 20 years ago, and so I kind of accidentally learned about software development, agile ways of working from working there. But I've retained this interest in how people who study the humanities think about things. So even though I've been working in, very practical kind of technology landscape, always curious about how people think about things, ideas, sharing ideas with folks, especially ideas from kind of strange out there types of places. So I think, it kind of feels a little bit like we're full circle in having this conversation today.
And it's so important because especially now that we're talking about artificial intelligence, one of the things that many people don't appreciate is that linguistics is at the core of how large language models work. That's why they're called language models. And a lot of the work that we've done in linguistics, we as a society have done in linguistics, is going to be quite critical for those who want to benefit from and even productively use the language models, small and large, that are being created at the moment. Yeah. But first, tell us a little bit more about this, because of course you came from the linguistic side and you were working with that software company that produced language learning software, and you got exposed to this whole Agile thing. And one of the things I think Agile brings to the software world is this more people-centric, this more people-focused approach to how we manage work, how we distribute work, how we treat each other even. Was that something that attracted you to the whole agile way of working at that company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had been on the content development side, really thinking about how to teach people languages. And then I moved into project management. I was a traditional kind of waterfall project manager doing content project management. And so many of the things I found stressful about that work were resolved with the way that Agile looks at these kinds of problems. So how do we approach, building at work as a team, being collaborative, instead of having this phase happens and then we hand off to this other group of people, or even just acknowledging the reality that we can't predict everything in advance. I spent a lot of time painstakingly crafting these Gantt charts that would then the next day be immediately out of date. And the level of stress and anxiety, like for myself as a new project manager, but like more importantly for the whole group of people working on those projects, was just untenable. And so, once I learned more about agile ways of working, it's like, well, let's just accept some realities. Like we can't possibly anticipate, some of the problems we had on that first project that I worked on were things like a volcano erupted in Iceland and disrupted air traffic and plans that we had for collaborating with people internationally. It's like that couldn't have possibly come up on my risk register. And yet I felt like guilty that I hadn't anticipated it. So I think, the agile ways of framing things helped me release some of those unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, that phrase, I felt guilty about, in this case, the volcano in Iceland, which of course you have no control over. Right? And that brings us to a topic, we'll explore that a bit further later, which is this systems of control that Foucault talks about in his book, Discipline and Punish. Yeah. And he talks about how the culture we create has this kind of perverse effect of limiting the culture we can imagine. It's kind of this self-feeding cycle. And coming back a little bit more to the ground floor here and talking about agile and how we look at the work and talking about like traditional project management, which I've been too. I consider myself a recovering project manager. I can't stop but thinking that one of the key aspects that we are trying to do with agile adoption, or one of the key things we're trying to do, is to transform the world of work. And that's no small mission in itself, right? But you work with people, right? You help other coaches and you're a coach yourself. You work with people that are trying to do this all the time. So my question to you is, all right, so you felt guilty about the exploding volcano. How did you deal with that? And today, when you're helping other coaches, how do you help them deal with that?
Yeah. So at the time that happened, I didn't have like these mental models to release those things. So instead I was thinking this was an error in my planning. I failed to acknowledge all of these, potential catastrophes and put them. Now, since then, I've come to realize, well, that's not a failure. It's not about failure of planning. It's about response. So how do we, when things happen, and they inevitably will, that we didn't anticipate, how do we choose to respond to them? So that, having that lens, which I didn't have at the time, now that's very different. So how do we create a proactive, forward-looking orientation instead of some of these, failures of control, that I was concerned with at the time.
I like when you said it's not about predicting, it's about responding to what happens, right? And that's kind of at the core of what Agile is all about. What have you seen work out there to help people understand that we do need to shift our mind from trying to predict to being ready to respond?
I think part of it is, and this connects to some of our conversation around Foucault's thinking, is just understand what gives us the idea in the first place that we should have been able to predict that. Like, where does that notion even come from? And so I think a lot of our entrained assumptions about work or how we go through the struggles that we have are the result of unexamined assumptions, that many of which have historical origins. So if we think, why is it that we think about these things in as a problem? part of it's because we have inherited some expectations about how work, from the industrial age. And they may not be relevant anymore. They're unexamined assumptions. So, that's one of the things that I find, like, where when we think about philosophy or different ways of viewing the world, it can be really helpful for kind of dropping the scales from our eyes, if you will.
So we will be dropping the scale. So everybody
Yeah.
keep in mind these ideas: systems of control, language that influences culture, culture that influences language. We'll come to all of those and explain a little bit more how we can use them in our work. But now, I know you're a fan of Michel Foucault. I am a fan of Michel Foucault, and we were talking about this Discipline and Punish book that you had read and showed me when we were having that conversation. But before we dive into all of those concepts, for those that are not yet familiar with the book, can you share some of the key lessons from that book that you relate to your work as an Agile coach?
Yeah. So I'll share kind of just the overall conceit of the book. It's a history of like a modern history of the prison. So how is it that our current system of justice and discipline has evolved? And it's really startling, actually, when you begin the book. He gives a description of very graphic torture and punishment of someone who is accused or convicted. I use that term loosely, of attempting to kill the king in France. And so it goes, how did this happen? Where in the course of very short period of time throughout the Enlightenment, we abandoned as a society, the idea that corporal punishment, like all these things, instantly became barbaric. Maybe not instantly, but the idea that it becomes barbaric to inflict torture upon a body, and instead we have kind of the prison as our catch-all for ways of disciplining people. And he extends this beyond thinking about like the penitentiary system or the legal system into mechanisms of control in modern society. So there's a connection between how prison works and how hospital works, or how military barracks works, or school, and so or a factory, or even today, in a modern office. And so there's this shift in how we think about power from being in the sovereign body of a king to being decentralized and also individualized into each person. So there's this core idea he talks about is a technology called the Panopticon, which was invented by Jeremy Bentham. Am I pronouncing that right? I'm getting
I think
right?
it is. Yeah, I think it is.
Bentham.
Yeah.
So the idea being, in a prison, you have like a design where there's a central tower where you cannot see in, but it is clear that the person who is inside the tower can constantly see out. And all of the cells of the prison are arranged so that they constantly can be in view. So it's a 360 kind of arrangement. So the prisoners can't tell if they're being monitored, but there's always the possibility of being monitored. And so this kind of extends into a metaphor of how surveillance works in modern society. So if you think about, the fact that all of your communication has a potential to be observed, we police ourselves. We no longer need brutal force because the threat of being watched all the time is enough to get people to control their own actions and behave in a docile kind of way. So it's kind of creepy and disturbing when you think about all of these things. I'm sure I know that there are many things that I've missed here, but those are some of the ideas that captivated me as I was, reading the work.
It is very creepy and it is very disturbing. And of course, also as rational human beings who try to understand the world around us, it's also important to understand that many of those methods are currently being used.
Oh, even probably more so than would have been imagined. The Foucault died in the 80s, so I can't even imagine what he would have thought about
social
today.
media.
Yeah, social media. All of our communication being electronic. The fact that almost everyone has a doorbell camera on their home, like we have surveillance to a level that's wasn't even possible technologically at the time.
And as Agile coaches, I think it is upon us also to recognize that some of these methods are being used right now. I mean, everybody's familiar with the open office plan.
Yeah.
And that's Panopticon applied in practice, where a boss in the corner can see everybody, and everybody needs to look busy. Because if they don't...
And why do we suppose it's so, the work from home has become this flashpoint now? You no longer have observable bodies unless you deploy some kind of software that monitors people's
And
keystrokes.
some companies have done that.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, so I think there's a lot that's really relevant for, our modern workplace and society, but also, a thread that I've been kind of toying with in my mind is, where some of our ideas that I would consider virtuous, at least on the surface, about agile ways of working, do they have also a darker side to them? So transparency, for instance, or our use of metrics and measuring things and empiricism. These are all ways of kind of categorizing, separating out individuals thinking about things so that you have control over them. Or, when we think about the self-organizing team, there's a line in Discipline and Punish where Foucault's talking about how, that once you know that you're subjected to a field of visibility, you assume responsibility for the constraints of power. So if you're in a self-organizing team and you know that like you're assuming your own discipline and control, and so you are inscribing on yourself the method of power and discipline. You don't need a boss because you're doing it to yourself. So that's kind of interesting to think about. There's some efficiency that's created by the methods that we use, and I would love to believe that they're all purely virtuous, but there's also this broader historical context that we live in that makes there multiple sides to this.
We've now started to kind of dive a little bit deeper to this
Yeah.
concept of systems of control, and we've talked about one, which is the visibility, right? Like when somebody is visible by some higher authority, they will eventually tend to discipline themselves and their peers. Let's not forget that is one of the things that is also happening, because now you're also visible to your peers, especially with today's world of work, where a lot of it is knowledge work and we need to work in teams, and therefore also there's many more eyes on you than there were before, when there was only one boss looking at you and you could hide a lot more easily. That's one system of control, the visibility. But there's another one, which is one that you and we both are victims of, which is this concept of language and culture, right? So one of the aspects that Foucault talks about is the discourse, or more generally, culture, which kind of defines what's okay and what's not okay to talk about. So when you work with teams, and also when you work with other agile coaches, how do you bring those thoughts into the work?
Yeah, I think so. Part of it is I like to pay attention to what isn't being said in any conversation, and that can include who isn't speaking or what are the topics that we don't discuss. But very often, I think you learn something about the culture of the organization you're in when you see what is not being communicated, or when there's someone brings a question or something and that immediately gets shut down. That tells you've touched something that may be taboo, or they're instrumental to the functioning of the system. So like I'll just share an example that maybe is relatively common. We talk about motivating people to work in teams and incentivizing teamwork. When you bring that to, well, how does this actually apply in an organization where we do things like forced ranking of individual performance, or where we have to distinguish between the performance of one person on the team and give a quantitative difference that then may result in a different financial compensation? How do we think if that becomes taboo, like let's motivate the team, but let's not touch the compensation structure, or let's not touch any discussion of how the behind the scenes things that happen from a HR performance management. Now we know there's something in there about, now we maybe don't know what it is or why, but that gives us a clue that there's something more powerful that's really hard to talk about in that organization. And some of that goes to like even just our ways that we think about go extending beyond that individual organizational culture. Like we are all used to being given a grade, like since school, so that, and that if you look at Foucault, like that would be a way of individualizing, categorizing, ranking. All of those things are forms of kind of modern discipline and punish. So you're able to distinguish among the individuals who's performing, who's not performing. And so we accept these things since we've been indoctrinated in them since we were tiny children as a completely normal way of doing things. But when you maybe step out of the modern historical context and think, well, in the, I don't know, did they have performance evaluations in medieval guilds? Like, did you get like, did you get an annual review? Like,
They had
was that
shiny
a
objects that
was that a thing?
depicted power and
Right,
importance, right?
right. And I'm not trying to like romanticize other times in history. Obviously there are definite drawbacks to any point in time, but some of these things that we really take for granted weren't always there. And so we might ask, like, will they continue to be necessary as society
I would
evolves? I
ask,
don't know.
I would ask also, how are they preventing us from imagining a better world of work?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And I felt that very clearly when I started the whole discussion together with a few other people like Woody Zuil and Neil Killick, the discussion about no estimates all the way back in 2008, and then a lot more than in 2012. And then when I wrote the book, I felt that distributed discipline and punish system of control that prevented us from talking about how to work with no estimates. Like I'm reminded of that Wittgenstein quote: "What can be said at all can be said very clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must be silent about."
Yes.
And that I would say reaction to the whole idea of working without estimates is a great example of that quote, because you are not allowed to talk about how to work without estimates, because estimates are part of the dominant form of discipline and punish or system of control of the industry we are part of.
Exactly. And it's we even allow ourselves to think out of it's can you even, I guess it was a Wittgenstein like question, like can you even think out of something that's not contained within your language, or is that the boundary of our thinking?
And it is, right? Because if you
yeah.
think about it, the language is literally the boundary of our thinking. I mean, I guess there are people who can think without words, but most of us do think with words, right? And if we can't imagine something as a word, we can't imagine it, right? Like I know there are visual people who can imagine images and then later on figure out what words could describe them, but most of us don't think that way, especially not persons like me who studied engineering, because that's all we do. We do numbers and words. There's nothing else, right? And for me, when I think about this, especially the aspect of culture as a system of control at work, specifically in this regard, I think that Agile is a great example of how we can change things, and quite drastically so.
Yeah.
Although not everywhere, because in some places Agile is used as kind of a lipstick on the pig, or smoke and mirrors. But where it really is used, it really is a transformative idea that created itself a new culture of work.
Yes, exactly. So like, and having I think part of it for coaches and scrum masters is having awareness of how profound the changes that you're bringing. Like because even if you're only focused on practices or what have you, you're still challenging through those practices. Even if you weren't even trying to touch culture, you're still challenging some deeply held assumptions about how work is supposed to work. And they extend beyond that organization. They extend into culture and how we think about how all things are kind of structured and designed. So that if you're in a place where it feels like, oh, well, we're not making any progress, there are huge forces against that progress. Or maybe, we make a little progress and it goes back. This is pretty fundamental change that we're talking about. And it's subconscious in many levels. So,
And I think for us as Agile coaches, it's also very important to understand that it's also a very big inner change. Like we are changing. Let's not forget that for most of us, maybe not all of us anymore, but for most of us, we started working in a world that did not accept or even think of this new way of working.
yes, exactly. And you can retain some of the rules of the previous way without even being aware of them. If I think about my early years of working in Agile, like just paint a very stark Machiavellian picture of how my view was. It's like, oh, well, this is more efficient. Like it is more efficient to make sure that progress is on track, to control and see where people are at, because I have all of these tools now that give me visibility. I don't have to go around individually with my clipboard and ask everyone if they're off track or not, and then try to tell if they're lying to me because I have the burn down chart, or I have some other instrument of transparency that I can use. Now, I think there's, something where it's like held into this, need to control. Over time, my approach has relaxed quite significantly. It's like I'm more interested in, like, instead of controlling that, like, are we opening ourselves to the real possibilities that are emerging here? And if we're focused on controlling to a plan, we're going to miss those opportunities or breeding the environment or the other things that need to happen. But that transition for me, I don't know if it was, I don't even know if it's complete. And it also has taken many years of being around people who looked at it very, very differently, and reading from thinkers, who think about it very differently. So we can retain those old systems without realizing it.
Absolutely. And those systems show up in the most innocent of things, like the words we use, right? Like what you said, there's still a lot of people who talk about efficiency as it being the holy grail. We're not talking, for example, that efficiency is a word of control, because efficiency means you're being measured and you need to attain a certain level of performance. And we also are not talking about the fact that businesses don't need to be efficient to be successful. In fact, many large and successful companies out there today are not even trying to be efficient. They're trying to focus on other things. Of course, this is not true 100% of the time of those companies. Sometimes they do focus on being efficient. And what I think about this transformation you talked about is that I think from my own experience, it is never complete. Mm-hmm. I am a victim of those systems of control today, as I was before. Maybe what is different now is that I try to be aware of being a victim. But then again, as you were talking about a minute ago, as long as I use the same language I was using before, even in the odd chance that I would recognize in the moment that I am following certain ideas, I would not even necessarily imagine a different way of thinking about whatever the topic is.
Yes, exactly. We just take so much of it for granted because we're completely steeped in it. So, that's like where I think, reading about history, philosophy, literature, anything that steps you out of your current moment in time is very helpful for jiggling those, preconceptions and assumptions, and just starting to think, well, why is it that way? Does it have to be that way? And how does where and how I've grown up just influence my set of assumptions about what works or doesn't work? It's highly subjective. It's all subjective. So,
one thing that I wanted to come back to is that, of course, Agile is a transformation in how we look at work. But if we just look at the manifesto, even the words we are using in the manifesto are a clear product of the, I think, dominant work culture that is there still today, right? Like, for example, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. This is still a lot in the old language, and I mean old not as in being very old, but like the current dominant language. It's not yet a new language. We will find other ways to say the same things. We are already finding new ways, like empathy, kindness, psychological safety, intrinsic motivation. Those are all words that are firmly in the individuals and interaction side of that value, right? But it does take, let's say, time for those words to kind of become norm and part of the culture that we want to have at work. In your own experience, like what has worked for you to kind of bring these new words to the people you coach and to help them realize that they can step out of the old phrases and step into the new words that are more in line with the Agile ideas?
Yeah, I think, well, part of it is just some realization that what we're talking about there, like kindness or empathy, or like it's about humanizing work. And so then, one must ask, like, why is that necessary? What makes work to begin like not human? And then, so, one of the greatest light bulb moments for me came from reading this lovely book called Artful Making, which is about theater and agile and ways of what managers today might need to know about how artists work together. And one section of the book, they give a history of Taylorism, like inventions over the last 200 years, and how that's framed our way of thinking about things. So if you think of the idea of interchangeable parts, these are historical inventions that have influenced our way of thinking. 300 years ago, would you have needed to have a conversation about like treating people with empathy? You had different power structures at place, feudalism and whatnot, but understanding that this isn't like, these aren't necessarily new concepts, but that we're putting them in this context where we've been shaped for the last 200 years by thinking about machines and making things efficient, mass production. All of that has influenced our thinking. So if you step out of that for a second, and connect to who are you as a human being? What are you outside of work? Maybe it's not that difficult to discover these things, and then just inviting a little bit of that to come back in. But they can feel almost subversive in some instances. And so, what is that?
Yeah, because we are, after all, in a Panopticon, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, then you have people like just even the phenomena of, what is authentic leadership? And people have to talk about like, well, how much authenticity or vulnerability is okay or not okay? I mean, all of that, like, you'd think that that's just being yourself, but no, it's being constantly watched and amplified by the Panopticon. And so, there's a level of thought that people have to give to these things that maybe they never did before, because of the circumstances that we live in.
And for us as Agile coaches, that level of thought is really important, because we can't be agents of transformation where we are if we are not able to step out of the things that are constraining that place of work to stay where it is at the moment.
Yes. Yes.
And looking at examples from other industries, I think, is a great way to start transforming our way of thinking about how work is managed.
Yes, having those other models and different ways of we can be successful in a whole variety of different fields of, if you think about different fields of study or different areas of work, what's successful in those kinds of, are there patterns that we can borrow or play with? But knowing that, like, just the act of doing that, it's going against ways that we're conditioned. So I think having like humility for the depth of the work and the depth of the challenge, and not allowing yourself to be overwhelmed by lack of success. Like, these are generational changes. The work will not be done in our lifetime. So
we are changing the world of work, whether we recognize it or not.
Right.
And it's very important to recognize the dimension of the task ahead, not to be discouraged, but rather to be more active and proactive in finding those other sources of inspiration.
Right. And I view it as like building a cathedral, right? If you're laying the first bricks in the cathedral, you may never step foot in that finished building, but how many generations forward well. That's that still brings meaning to the work, even if you aren't going to see it completed.
I think that's a beautiful metaphor, by the way. Okay, but talking about the inspiration, I am fascinated by philosophy, not just Foucault's work, but what are other sources of inspiration that you have found that you bring to your work as a coach?
Yeah, so I like to read in kind of diverse genre. So, recently I've been exploring some different histories of thinking. So I dabbled in a little bit of Marx, a little bit of utilitarianism, which is where we get some of the Panopticon thinking. I've been doing some reading along that. Also, a lot of fiction. I like reading literature, and so I'm always curious about what I learn from fiction, and that I think fiction is such a great teacher of empathy, because when you're reading a novel, for instance, you're occupying the space of these characters and maybe a totally different place and time, a way of thinking, and you can relate, you can experience what it's like to be that person. So if you're that may sound like completely unrelated to what we do, but I think there's more and more that I learn about from fiction. How do you understand a person's perspective? Are they a reliable narrator? These are all questions we get from reading literature. So, those also, Edgar Schein has so much wonderful work on organizational culture. So kind of bridging that gap between organizational science and, and then thinking about these things as a jumping off point for learning about empathy or culture. A lot of his work has been really inspiring to me recently. So
very good. I'll put some links on the show notes for some of that. I agree with you regarding literature. I think it can be really a gate to a new world. And if we go there with the curiosity and the intuition of getting inspired, we will find the inspiration, right?
Yeah.
But if we talk about now the systems of control topic, which I accept we only really touch the surface of it at the moment, or with this episode. It is, after all, a half-an-hour episode, so there's not much more you can do. But what's one resource you would recommend for people that want to dive into this idea of systems of control and understand more what they are and how they themselves are being part of those systems of control?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind for me is a relatively short article I read several years ago in Harvard Business Review. It's an interview with Edgar Schein. The title of the article is The Anxiety of Learning. And for me, this was profoundly impactful because he talks about when we ask people to learn new things or try new, any kind of change initiative in an organizational context, what is it that we're really doing? We're asking them to give up beliefs or values, and that is not, as he says, that is not a joyful process. And he compares this experience that very common experience we'll have in organizations with some of his early research on prisoner of war camp survivors from the Korean War and the effects of brainwashing. And it's really startling, like the parallel that he draws between, he called, coercive persuasion in organizations and these more extreme circumstances of like a POW camp. And anyway, I found it startling and incredibly useful for understanding the perspective. When I experienced resistance to change, I had a completely different viewpoint about it after reading that article and diving into it a little bit more. So that would be a good place to start, 20 minutes, just get some wheels turning.
Absolutely. And I'm already interested in reading it when you link that to resistance to change.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Michelle, it's been a pleasure. Unfortunately, as all the episodes do, we're coming to an end. But before we go, where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Michelle Pauk. That's Pauk. I'd love to connect with anybody who's listening to the show. Also, my website is streamsidecoaching.com. And I share articles, little blog posts, stories about resistance to change, a few other topics there. I'm really interested, though, in hearing people's stories and experience as they've been thinking about, what we've talked about today. discipline, control, how that happens in the modern workplace. I've got in mind a topic for a book, and I'd love to interview people on their experiences in this realm. So, if you have something you'd like to share about your feelings there, I'd love to hear it.
Absolutely, everybody. Do go to LinkedIn. The link is in the show notes, and reach out to Michelle and ask a few follow-up questions.
Great.
Michelle, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Oh, likewise. This has been a blast. Thank you, Vasco.
Hi there, Agile friends. Thank you for sticking around and listening to the details of the Product Owner Summit, this year's global summit dedicated to a critical Scrum role, the product owner role, of course. We'll have some amazing keynotes and 4 tracks filled with first-hand stories and experiences for product owners to learn more about that critical Scrum role. The summit will take place between April 23rd and 25th, so book your calendars. There will be loads of sessions for you to attend. One of the keynotes will be Dave West, the product owner and CEO at Scrum.org, one of the largest Scrum organizations in the world. If you want to know more, check out the details at bit.ly/product owner 2024. That's all one word, all lowercase, bit.ly/product owner 2024. We will also have 4 tracks. The 4 tracks will cover cross-functional product ownership. That's track 1. As Pixar's Ratatouille said, not every idea can be a great idea, but a great idea can come from anywhere. And this quote emphasizes the importance of a product owner being open to all ideas, regardless of the source, and also challenges us to focus on getting good ideas from everywhere and involving the whole team in the product owner role and responsibilities. The second track is Designing Products for Growth, where we explore how to craft products ready for scalable growth, merging practical strategies with innovation. The idea here is to learn to design products for growth, whether it is sales or customer acquisition. The third track is Know Your Users, user-centric approaches for agile development. In this track, we learn to master user-centric techniques in agile development, to deeply understand customer needs and transform insights into meaningful UX designs that focus on engagement and satisfaction. This is a track ideal for innovation-focused agile teams. And the fourth track, one of the most exciting tracks in my opinion, is product development with AI, ideas for product owners. Not only do we discuss about using AI in the products, but also AI for product owners to learn to make a bigger impact with the help of the AI tools that we already have. The Product Owner Summit will also present to you great opportunities to network with your peers. So get your ticket and join our Slack. You can get the ticket and join the Slack at bit.ly/product owner 2024. As always, we have free tickets and also the paid tickets that help to support this podcast. So check them out at bit.ly/product owner 2024. That's all lowercase, all one word, product owner 2024. I'll see you in the summit floor.